Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you on Channel 9 and also on WJOPLP Newburyport, Joppa Radio at 96.3 FM. We're also live streaming on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm delighted to welcome today's guest who is here to talk to us about the timely and important topic of reparations. Dr. E. Howard Ashford was raised in Mississippi. He holds an impressive 5 degrees in accounting, public policy and administration, history, and Afro-American studies. He's currently an assistant professor of African American history in the Africana and Latinx Studies Department at SUNY Oneonta, where he will be the incoming department chair for the 2021 to 22 academic year. His first monograph, Mississippi Zion, The Struggle for Liberation in Attala County, 1865 to 1950, is scheduled to be published and released as a book in 2022 with the University Press of Mississippi, which is very exciting news. So welcome, Howard. First of all, congratulations on your book, and thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show.
Good morning. I am quite just excited to be here and pleased to be here. And I am happy to speak about the things I do know, and hopefully those who are here today will learn something or get some things out of this talk today.
I think that's almost certain to happen, Howard. And I've been looking forward to your visit for weeks, ever since I read in the news recently that the House Judiciary Committee passed a measure to advance to the full House a vote on H.R. 40, which would create a commission to examine slavery and discrimination in the United States from 1619 to the present, and would recommend ways to educate Americans about its findings and suggest possible remedies and compensation. H.R. 40 has been lying fallow in Congress since Representative Conyers of Michigan introduced it for the first time in 1989. So this is the first time it's ever come up for any kind of vote, although its prospects for passage within the full House remain uncertain. But I was hoping, Howard, that you could start us off by reminding us all of the significance of that number 40 in the bill's title, H.R. 40, because it's a meaningful choice.
40 acres and a mule, that was the concept of how do you repay those who were enslaved, or to give them their due start, because you could not go back and take back those the years of slavery. But how do you get people started in a world, in a land where they are now free? And the expectations of now that you are free is that you act as though, someone who's able to give back to the country that's in which they live in. So this idea of land, because at that time, land was gold. Land was what you needed to get started. And therefore, the concept that you would give at least every adult, I would say male, but that's like your leads of household. That they would get that's like X amount of land, a plot of land, and quote unquote a mule to get them started, because what people had known was the land, how to farm it, how to grow crops on it, and therefore that would be seen as a way for them to get the start that they would need to, one, to live, and two, compete in society. And it was the country's way of, at that time, it could have been the country's way of bringing it together that now included all people, and you were going to give those individuals who were once enslaved lands that were either confiscated or the lands that were owned by people who left them abandoned. So it's important to know that like you weren't going to go in to take lands from people who had a legitimate claim to that land. It was X amount of lands that fit under a specific box or category. But it did not come to light. That concept, except it was bailed on, although Black people at that time had shown that if given access to land that they could do X, Y, and Z with it. But that wasn't enough to kind of stop the movement towards going back a step or 10 to where you do not want to anger those in the South who are white by completely changing society, where literally like overnight Black people have truly become your equals, if not going a little bit like ahead of you as well. And so that number itself is significant because you're trying in itself repair, give back what could have put the end to this conversation today if it had happened then, because we're talking about the people who lived through the institution of slavery. They were going to get because that's your one-to-one. And it's almost like I feel by using that in the title of the bill is a reminder of what could have been if a Congress had the nerve to go through with it. And so hopefully now Congress has the nerve to go through with it. If not, that number will be on the next bill decades later.
Yeah, it's a reminder of a broken promise. And a betrayal, because of course when people who'd been enslaved were freed, they had nothing. And this would have, as you've explained eloquently, it would have meant that they had something, and something that they knew how to work with and how to generate wealth from. And they would I like the way you put it, they would have been truly equal. And yet the Congress just did not have it within its, I don't know what the right adjective is, sense of fairness, imagination may be key here to follow through on the deal.
I think the imagination was there because it was out there and the concept was out there. I think a lot of things changed when Johnson came in to the White House. And people have to understand that Johnson as VP, his views of when he was chosen as VP completely changed when like he was in charge as president, that he became far more like understanding to those in the South who had lost their lands, who had lost their wealth, whereas before, like he was anti-owner, anti kind of the elite class. And there, but then that shifts and that changes, and kind of he allows for this repeating of what was the South to reconstruct itself. And a part of that was this anti-Blackness that Johnson had, which does lead to him, his historic nature of being, almost taken out of office. That's like impeached, but not, he stayed in. But it also goes to show just how weak that Reconstruction actually was. Although historically it's presented as this glory age of Black advancement, Black, that's achievement and excellence, although a lot of times that's limited to who held power, who was elected to office. But as a totality, it does show the weakness of Reconstruction and what did Black people get out of Reconstruction. You have, one, you're freed, legally freed by the Constitution. You are and indeed seen as a as a citizen of the country, and you can vote.
Yeah.
On paper, but
Yes.
getting that to actually play out in real life, where you can do things just as a white person could do without anyone trying to stop you, through any hurdles or things of that nature. That just kind of goes to show that how we view this era, that's a Reconstruction. It was a lot of things on paper. That's like the imagination was there, but how do you instantaneously turn a society where some are free and some are not, into a society where everyone is free?
Yeah.
And then the notion of freedom does not mean that you're equal.
Right.
And so that's where I think this conversation has to happen. Just because you're free does not mean that you're equal. And that's just not limited to a particular region of the country, the South. It's also the North, it's the Midwest, it's the West Coast. And so I think that it could have been, but the deeply held views of Black people as slaves, those who were free, that prevented a lot of those ideas from coming to light. Because how do you live in a nation where your identity as someone who is white is so connected to being free and having your labor free? And now everyone is free, then, but though in your mind, someone has to be a slave, because that's the world in which you grew up in. And if it's not Black people, then is it going to be white people that are poor? And then how do you keep that in check to where, quote unquote, white people that are poor do not become the new Black, as Black people, even though they did not get anything out of slavery, once they were free, they already had in mind what they wanted to do. They wanted to own land. They wanted to go to school. They wanted to show what they could do if people would leave them alone. And so at the hundreds of years of slavery, you see them come out the gate, and not everyone has an equal that's experienced in slavery. Some come out of slavery with skill sets. They can read. Some come out just with the sheer will to want to live a life that is better. But Leon Litwack captures this Black life after slavery, once they are free, the things that they are doing through their lens. And it shows what they could accomplish, what they could do, because they have seen it done. They watch their owners. They know whether or not they knew every exact kind of nuance to what is land owning, how to do contract signing, and so forth like that. They knew what they had to do. The problem was letting them do that. They weren't asking for anything, just to be really left alone and treated as you would treat anybody else. Unfortunately, there were large parts of society that just could not let Black people be free, yet alone equal. And so when we're talking about how do you repair, you have to also talk about what were Black people trying to do? What did they do? And then what's the response to that? How is it when they're trying to just become part of the society, become part of the country in which they built, substantially built a large amount of it? Why is it that elements of society could not let them be free? And then what does that then? I think that's a way to understand the need to repair and repay. So I think, so that's the part of history that gets lost, is Reconstruction takes up this big, it blocks out what Black people were doing. And it really shows what white individuals were doing either to help Black people, but it's not showing what Black people were doing themselves to situate themselves, because what were Black people, in a sense, trying to reconstruct? They were not trying to reconstruct the old South. They were not trying
right.
to reconstruct a union and where they are not free. They're trying to construct. No, they're trying to be free, truly free. That's a liberation aspect of it.
Yes.
But as they're trying to be free, there's a need to redeem, because we have to also understand what's the understanding of most white individuals is, again, if they're not enslaved, then that could be us. So we need to redeem the old South so that we can remain free. So you have these competing ideas of what is free and equality, and kind of which group know what causes one thing to happen to and fro, and who comes out on top, so to speak, as a way to understand which areas need to be looked at first when we're talking about repairing, reparations.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Howard. That was an excellent explanation, and just helps us understand that tension that arose early on. One of the things I was struck by in what I was reading about HR 40 was its emphasis on educating Americans. And thank you. You've just started that. You just helped that process right there, because I haven't heard it talked about in quite the way that you just explained it. Of course, as HR 40 progresses, there will be a lot of argument, heat and light, with varying degrees of illumination and accuracy. And you've just filled in one of the foundational chapters in American racial history that's important for people to understand. But I wonder what other, perhaps more recent chapters post-Reconstruction you think are essential for Americans to be better educated about, in order for our congressional leaders in our nation to make an informed and a fair decision about reparations?
Ooh, that's a
big question.
One, in general, before I move onward, people just have to understand what is history, period. History is a story. That's what it is. It's a story that you can tell from different viewpoints and angles and perspectives, depending on what you're interested in, depending on what you're looking at per se. But always, you have to include everyone in that story. Now, to jump ahead, we have to understand Jim Crow. We have to understand the origins of Jim Crow and what Jim Crow is and what Jim Crow does. And again, as a perspective of a story, Jim Crow, as I was taught, is this structure that kind of rises up out the ground and just boxes in Black people, from which they are then struggling to defeat. And we have to understand that Jim Crow is a construction in itself to control. So post-Reconstruction, which a lot of people just completely start as the Jim Crow era, the nadir is actually the era that comes between the actual start of Jim Crow. But I think historians struggle over what year does Jim Crow start? And you can start in different years, but post-Reconstruction, the Black trajectory was moving upwards, despite this notion that, after the troops left and home rule sets in and white supremacy sets in, and now Black people are kind of just stagnated. No, the same Black people that was trying to break away from those who held them in chains and bondage and slavery, those are the same individuals in Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. So that spirit does not die to fight. Land owning continues. Black people, they are getting wealth. Schools are on the uprise. There are states where more Black children are going to school than white children. That is on the upward rise. It doesn't stop when the troops leave. So to understand Jim Crow, we have to understand what is it that Jim Crow is trying to do. And again, historians like Litwack explains, although I don't always agree with Litwack, but he's a great historian, is that one thing that we have to understand with Jim Crow is the children of those who were enslaved, who were born either in slavery, but right at the tail end of slavery, or those who were free, were not born into this world of you are owned by somebody. So they are being taught by their, their dads, their moms, aunts, uncles, people around them, freedom. They're seeing freedom. And therefore, Jim Crow in itself, as I see it, is a need to control the mind, in addition to one's labor and body. But you have to, as Litwack explains, reassert what it means to be Black in the South, or even in the North and the Midwest. And therefore, the Ku Klux Klan, this notion of the law is going to be reconstructed so where you cannot vote, or it's harder to vote, speaking up against whiteness as that's like an entity that can get you beat, that can get you killed, that like you can lose your land, basically to submit those Black people who were free, submit their minds to what society wants you to understand your lot in life is as a Black person. And to understand that Black people play a role in that. As odd as that sounds, if Black people were not on the upward trajectory, then there's no need to control them or this sense to control them and to stop them, because in some areas of the South, Black people are starting to move upward at a speed that whites are not. And so it's almost like you wake up one day and it's like, I did not see this coming, and what are we going to do to control that? And Black people are not scared of white people in that sense. But what Jim Crow does is that it brings the law into play. It brings the rule of law into play that does not provide the same protection to Black people as it does to white people. Therefore, you're not necessarily fearing whiteness, but you're fearing the law that whiteness has to allow it to do the things that it can do. It can't and I think that era of Jim Crow is that you have, what needs to be known is what would have happened if that upward trajectory had continued and this need to control Blackness in its upward movement had not happened. And then, because the other side of Jim Crow, then like you get your movements. And your movements of the 60s and before, then that's the response to Jim Crow. But Jim Crow in itself is a response to Black upward mobility. And therefore, what could have been, what was taken, what was stripped away. So what did white society gain by stripping away the gains that Black people had made? And Jim Crow is an expansive era in itself. So I think part of, you have to understand what Jim Crow actually was and what it did from the standpoint of one's ability to make money as equal to whites, one's ability to join unions, one's ability to go to the school of their choice, one's right to own land and not be scared off their land, one's right to live and exist and not be killed as by the KKK or any other individual that's at will or random, and no justice is served. And I think if you can understand Jim Crow besides the image that we have of Jim Crow, Black only, white only, kind of way of looking at it, and you really get into what did the people do, and what was happening with the people, then I think that's where, even if you don't agree with this idea that Black people get anything from the institution of slavery, Okay, well, it's the 100 years after slavery.
Mm-hmm.
That's, even if you don't know. And so that's where, I think you have to look at, especially post Reconstruction. And I would know, because what you see today is the continued extension of that. Even if you want to talk about something happening now, if you look at Georgia's new law in terms of voting, that's why you need reparations, because as Black people, brown people, etc., are participating, including themselves in society, the response is remove them out of it. And therefore, you're actually, the people who don't support this bill, you're actually giving support to it. Your actions are the reason why you need reparations in whatever light it comes in. Just by action, response, action, response, action, response. You want people to vote, you want people to do their duty. It's a privilege to vote, although it's a right to vote, not a privilege. And when you do it, then you try to take it away. It's the same thing that has been happening continuously. So I think, but you really have to understand the origins of Jim Crow from two ways: how Black people are moving up and a need to hold them down, to move white individuals up who may not have taken advantage of the society that has been constructed, so that they do have more chances to succeed.
That was that's fascinating. Thank you, Howard. Let's talk about the economic consequences of the dynamic you've just been talking about, which repeats itself over history. I haven't read the whole book, but there's data that I saw from a book called, it's a great title, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century by William Darity and Kirsten Mullins. And the data is striking on financial inequality. The average white family has a phenomenal 10 times the wealth of the average Black family. White college grads have 7 times the wealth of Black college grads. And white high school dropouts have more wealth than Black college grads. So Howard, what do this type of disparity today, what does this type of disparity tell us about the cause, and also what the remedies are to create a more level financial world in the United States?
I think the cause part is easier to answer than the latter part in terms of what is the remedy of it. When I was reading that question that as well that you sent, I was most struck by dropouts that do have more than those who do go to college. White dropouts and Black individuals who do go to college and get a degree. Now, even in that, there is, you have to look at it in different ways as well. Do you have a skill that you then turn into a career, then that you turn into land owning, home owning, etc.? Do you have a degree but then don't do anything with it? Do you have a degree and you try to move up into a particular that's like industry and you're blocked because of your skin color despite your degree? So there are ways to kind of look at it so that you do give people their due, even if you didn't go to college or you dropped out of high school, but you turned that into something. So I do want to say that as opposed to just something that's given to people. We have to look at what are the opportunities that are there, even if you have a college degree. Does that make you more of a threat to some people? No, than having someone who does not have an education, who may get a job because, they don't have an education, therefore I can control them a bit more easy. I think we have to look at the roots of education and what does it mean to see a Black body that has a brain. And understanding history, which I will always refer to history, is that the biggest fear was Black people learning how to read and write. Because to read and write, that means you can think.
Yeah.
And when you can think and you know, and you know, there's no a fear that you will understand like what is going on and you will want to change that. So understanding that, what does it mean for someone who is Black to have a degree of any kind? But using myself as an example, I have a lot of degrees. I am highly educated, one would say.
Yes.
That has worked in my favor, but again, at times it has not worked in my favor. But then, like, what does it say that I felt like that I had to get a doctorate to compete? Period. But at the same time, getting a doctorate can make you a threat. You know, if you're deemed to know too much or know like more than someone who thinks that they should know just like more than you. And so that can play a role in why Black people who do have a degree, who then try to make a career out of it, why they do not necessarily move up as far, because your degree alone does not equate to you getting a job. It means that someone will look at you to potentially give you a job. But once you're in that space, then what do you have to contend with to move up, despite you can work hard, etc. But then also, if you look at things in the other way and direction, it's really who you know as well. If you go to towns, small town America, large cities, who gets the contracts to build the buildings and the roads and so forth like that? If that's a small owned company where the dad hires the son hires a friend, the friend hires their family, and they may not have degrees, but they're keeping everything within a night and within a very tight space, and the money just kind of stays in the family, then you can build up your wealth that way as well. So I think that the disparities are going to be linked to history and understanding the struggles that a Black person has if you don't have an education, and the struggle you had if you do have an education. But there have been plenty of Black people who have been quite successful as well. You know, compared to the population, you know, the disparity, you know, is something that needs to be looked at and addressed. The remedy, that's the harder part. Having money doesn't mean that you're going to translate that into something that is long-term wealth. I believe, like, once I heard at some point, you know, everyone at some point, well, not everyone, but a lot of people at some point, you will come into a possession of a lot of money, $1 million or so. It may not come to you all at one time, but over the course of your life, you will have had access or touched like $1 million. It's different when it's all there at one time, or it's been handed to you generationally, as opposed to earning it and having to spend it to survive, earning it, having to spend it to survive. And I think that needs to be like understood. But the remedy of it, though, I think you have to. That's a question that, like, we can go on for hours. But just taking one look at it, I think is housing. Too many people, their home is worth, that's like everything. You know that's their largest asset is their home. We then have to look at then, why is it that a home that is occupied by a Black person, why is that worth less than a home occupied by a white person? That is the definition of institutional racism. That is built into the numbers. There's no
baked in, as they say.
Baked in. There's no logic to it. There's no science to it. And when you zone people into certain areas and neighborhoods, and then just say, well, this home in this area is worth this much, and this home in a white area is worth 10 times as much, then that home is something that you can hand down to the next generation that's going to keep getting more and more. That's in terms of value compared to a Black home that you can still hand down, but it's nowhere near. So we have to understand, how is it that homes in white, quote unquote, white areas are worth more than Black areas. And I think that that's one way to look at it. And that's one way you can look at the actual numbers and say, this is where, like we can start at, because that's just blatant. That's just blatant racism in itself.
Yeah.
So I think that that's one way to get to a solution, is to change how we look at home values.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's one way to start that change.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because if you look at the data, it's just so clear, the discrimination that's gone on. Well, famously redlining is the name they gave to it, and it's a good way to illustrate that there is institutional racism, and that it, every financial planner will tell you, buy a house, it's the way you build equity over time. And if you don't have the opportunity to build that equity, or if your home is dramatically undervalued because of the neighborhood that's in, then you are systematically and in an enduring way disadvantaged financially, and the generations that follow you will be as well. So I agree. I think that's a really good place to intervene and start, Howard. I wanted to ask you a little bit, because you're a historian, and you've been referencing and teaching us about history as the story, and filling in missing chapters, or the missing context of a lot of history. But I wanted to find out what you think about the movement that's been going on for since the 1619 Project, the New York Times. There's been a lot of pushback from spokespersons on the right, including people in Congress, to the 1619 Project, and more generally, though, not just the 1619 Project, but the whole idea that curricula in public schools would examine the long and brutal history of slavery and bigotry, Jim Crow, as you've been explaining, and the exploitation, and disadvantaging of African Americans, that this is seen as unpatriotic. They wouldn't put it this way, but I think some of them might put it this way. But the implication is that if we're honest about the moral abyss of slavery and America's long and really undeniable history of usurping land, exploiting Black, Indigenous, and people of color citizens, that is somehow, teaching that history is somehow tantamount to erasing any claim that the United States could otherwise claim or be proud of to having virtue or values. And I wonder how you understand, from a historical point of view, or just your own personal point of view, Howard, what's driving the timing of this effort, and the effort itself to, in effect, promote really a pretend American history?
One thing that I tell my students, and just in general, if you do not control your history, write your own history, it will be done on your behalf. And I think that is the fear, is this losing control of the narrative. Or it's a narrative where people who have traditionally been at the heart of it are no longer the heart of the narrative, or they're being discussed in a different way in which they no longer have control over. It will be akin to, I remember once in school, I was getting my degree in Black Studies, my doctorate in Black Studies, and we were reading a book on the Black church and Black women in the Black church, Jesus, Jobs, and Justice.
Oh,
and
good title.
Yeah. Collier Thomas, who's the author. And so we were doing our discussion of the book in major works, and I gave my critique of the book was that the author, who's a Black woman, did not spend enough time discussing Black men and why they felt the need to use the church as a way to show their independence, show their leadership and what they could do. And I'm thinking I just made this great critique of the book. I was told that my critique was completely off the mark. Dr. Bracy, who I think is just the smartest man on earth, said in these words, the one time that Black men are not the center of the narrative, you can't handle it. And it hit me that I'm so accustomed to reading history that's looking at not only men, but Black men, that when there's a book that's about Black women and that the author has designed it to look at the lives of Black women, my critique is not about the Black women she wrote about, but was the lack of Black men. And so it made so when we're not accustomed to a story centering what we should think should be us, then what we have to do is then push back against it to make it look like something about that particular angle is wrong. And I think that that's what you're seeing here is that this idea of Europeans coming over and changing this land that apparently had zero going on before they came over. Rick Santorum. And they made this land like what it is. Then to say, well, you were only able to do that because of this particular system of exploitation and murder and pillaging and stealing and manipulation, etc. That does not put out the image that a particular group wants to put out. However, though, in not showing the totality of history, you're actually teaching generation after generation after generation of children that one group is superior, even if you never use those words, white supremacy, blackness as being not supreme or etc. Just that narrative itself, just those images itself, if you're a white child, that's what you see. You see yourself as being, the stewards of this land, and it's your responsibility to continue to make it great, etc. And then if you're Black, you don't see yourself and you're seeing it like that you had no role in this, but when you show it all together, then you show that you just show a more truthful version that I think will help younger children understand. At least understand, give them the chance to think on their own, because students come to college and they come into my classroom, and they are upset because they're telling me history to them has been so whitewashed that they're angry that they've been going out there, spouting out what they've been taught, and they're seeing another version. And not that they have to agree with it, but they just wish they had the facts and the knowledge to give themselves a different perspective. They may have the same viewpoint, but at least they're now able to speak about it in a way that's far more up to date, that's intelligent, and it can be taught. As I teach my classes, it's in a neutral way. I teach history neutrally because I have white students, I have Black students, I have Latinx students, I have men, I have women, and you have to include everyone in that history. Although I tell it from the perspective of a particular group, I don't use the language of, oh, it's your fault, or people like you or your ancestors. No, this is what happened. How can we understand what is happening today? So every semester they have to write a paper. How do you see today's society being influenced by the past to connect the past to the present? And I like to think that they love my classes from the standpoint that they do get that space to keep their identity and not feel ashamed of their identity. That's either way, but just have a better sense of how to communicate or connect what's the past to the present. And I think you do that by starting history at a far more truthful perspective in time, to understand that this nation it's rooted itself in the elite and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. Class comes before race. Race becomes so entangled in class that's what you see first. But before there was slavery, you had a system that was rooted in class. you know, where you were indeed not a slave. No, you were a servant, and you're no, and you contracted your labor. You're indentured, and so how do you go from that type of system to a system that is rooted in color? And you can, so you understand that transition, and then how the law takes shape to legalize that. And there's nothing wrong with starting in 1619. If I was indigenous, I would say start earlier than that. You know, and so that 1619, you know, you can always move it back depending on the group. But, you know, it's important. And again, depending on how it's taught, it's just important to lay out the facts of history, not the story of make believe.
Yeah. Well, you know, first of all, it's clear just from our conversation and what you're saying about classroom that you are an extraordinarily gifted teacher, Howard. So I'm glad you're out there teaching. But it's also true that what you're talking about is, I'm thinking about, you know, any truthful history is going to be complex. It's going to involve multiple points of view, and it won't be a complete history of all those different points of view, and the truth isn't there. And, you know, knowledge is power.
Yes.
And true knowledge relies upon understanding, being able to tolerate complexity, even when it's not flattering.
Exactly.
So, you know, I did want to ask you, because I'm sure there will be much discussion about reparations forthcoming. And one of the most common criticisms of reparations is one that famously Minority Leader Mitch McConnell gave voice to. He said that reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for which none of us is still living is responsible, is not, in his opinion, a good idea. And in a similar vein, others argue that many Americans who have immigrated to the US long after emancipation, and, you know, after Jim Crow as well, would not have been involved in slavery or segregation, and yet their tax dollars would be included in reparation for evils that in theory they had nothing to do with. So what do you think about those arguments, Howard?
I was looking at that one too. I was thinking long about that one. Is if not for slavery, if not for Jim Crow and segregation, you wouldn't be able to have the head start that you have. Yeah. Meaning that your head start, you're being able to do the things that you want to do without hurdles linked to your skin color, or for you to come into the country and to be able to just come in and, like, you know, start a business, etc. Some group was enslaved and were stopped solely upon their skin color. If it wasn't us, it could have been you. And the story would be, then it would be a different story. That you have to understand that part of one of the reasons why why Black people were not given their land after slavery was, then who would be the new workforce? Because in a sense, Black people would then would not have any, let's say not any, but there would be less of a need to rely on the larger society if they had their own land that they could turn. No, they're what they wanted to be, free, and independent. But the country itself was built on controlled labor, forced labor. So if not, so who was going to be that group? And therefore, because Black people were that group, and then the long-standing ideas of what Blackness is, it's criminal, you know, it's dangerous, it's childlike, etc. If it wasn't us, then it was going to be another group. So you may not have participated in it, but you have reaped the gains of it substantially. Yeah. And also, you can block the argument yes, slavery has ended X amount of years ago in terms of the legal institution of it, but the impact has not ended. And then if you want to talk about the people living today, then you look at the 100 years of Jim Crow, but I'm using that quite loosely. 100 years after slavery, there are people living who were part of that system.
Yes.
There are children of the Jim Crow era who are still living.
Yeah.
And therefore, with that idea that no one's living or that like no one's alive today, that's a weak argument because McConnell is conveniently stopping in 1865, not 1965.
Yes.
And so I think with McConnell, who's not the smartest person in the world, that's where people need to start hitting back at. You know, you do have a Jim Crow era that's still living, and maybe that's where you need to start.
Yeah.
You know, we are descendants. I am a descendant of slaves. A few white men as well, but no, that's a different story. But I am a descendant of
but it's
slaves.
an important part of the history that is often neglected.
Yes. My father grew up in Jim Crow, you know, not just at the end of it. No, he grew up in Jim Crow South. You know, he went to a school that was all Black, but it's that generation that you have to look at because they lived through it. So you can't just conveniently cut off the year that because you don't want to deal with the 100 years afterwards. And also it's also, I think, a verdict on if you had just left Black people alone, like after slavery, and just let them do what they wanted to do.
40 acres and a mule.
We would not be having this conversation.
That's right.
And you can't, and that's the part of history that you want to tell a particular history or block off history, but history is a continual story.
Yeah.
And we like to think that at some point you yell cut, new actors, new lighting, you know, new set design comes in, but it's a continual story. And people like him, McConnell, is using his power to try to shape the understanding and minds of people, but completely ignoring the 100 years that Black people went after slavery, trying to get the freedom that they should have had once they were free.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you immigrate to this country, you don't immigrate to a country that's a blank slate.
Yes, very true.
And much of the reason that people are drawn to come to this country is because of you know, the system that has been built that has advantaged some people over others.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you so much, Howard. We don't have a whole lot of time left. I feel like I could talk to you all day.
But go over a little bit than an hour mark I gave you. So like it's okay to go a little bit over that because I'm enjoying this conversation.
Well, we have to end the show we have to end our show at 10. So maybe we'll just have to have you back.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
You know, I sent you all these questions ahead of time. So
yes.
You know what I want to talk. We haven't even got to James Baldwin, or we're not going to make it. I warned you. I knew. I always have so much more I'm curious about than I have time for. But maybe we'll talk later on about having you back. Good. But I did want to ask you if you would please share with us, just briefly, perhaps, Howard. I'm intrigued. Could you tell us a little bit about what your book, Mississippi Zion, is about?
Mississippi Zion, in a way, I've been speaking about it during this whole discussion. Mississippi Zion is a look at the tensions that lead to the necessity for Jim Crow. And since history kind of lumps the regions together, the South, Mississippi, Alabama, which are very large regions, I look at one particular spot in Mississippi. That's Atala County, which is in the heart of the state. It's right in the middle of the state. It's of Mississippi. And the state of Mississippi itself was the heart of the Old South, it's seen as the heart of the Old South. And therefore I chose the heart end of the heart itself. Yeah. Zion is home and Mississippi is my home. Yeah. Like Atala County is where I grew up. And so it's the history of this county through the lens of its Black people, its citizens coming out of slavery and but it pushes Reconstruction into the background. It doesn't acknowledge Reconstruction as this very distinct period. What it's looking at is coming out of slavery. Black people are in this era of liberation. It's a liberation era. It cannot, inside of this liberation era, Reconstruction happens, but Reconstruction does not define the Black experience. It's this movement to be truly free and liberated. But it also tackles white liberation through the lens of redemption. So you have two elements of being free. One is true liberation. One is this idea of redeeming to stay liberated. And it's showing those tensions as Black people become more educated, what laws are then kind of put in place to stunt that growth. What's the need for Black schools getting not as much money, paying teachers that are white more money, Black people that own land? What's the a consequence of that? White capping, where you scare Black people that's like off of their land. Voting, why do you have to have when you do have these rules in place, that's like a literacy test, etc. But to show what Black people have gained all this education that they just kind of swoosh past those literacy tests and they could pay the poll tax. So then what's the next thing? So it's showing how Black projection, upward projection leads to the need to have these like hurdles put in place, anti-Black hurdles put in place to stop that advancement as a way to understand how Jim Crow comes to be. So when you get to the 1900s and the 20th century, you can understand now the Black response to Jim Crow by understanding what Jim Crow itself is responding to. But as opposed to just getting examples all over the state of Mississippi, I just used this one county because its history in itself was not touched. It was preserved. And by me doing genealogy of my own history and family, so it's told through the actions of the people, not my analysis per se, but just the literal actions of the people. And one point of interest, if anybody wants to learn more about this county or state of Mississippi, is that this county is home to some of the larger names that we know today. One is Oprah Winfrey was born in Allen County.
No kidding.
What role did her great uncle play in Black people upward mobility? It's those kind of, although it's not about her, but it's everyday people by which she is connected to, and so it gives you history from the standpoint of Black people and their actions, and not painting Black people as like victims or kind of being stunted out of slavery. And the book has images, beautiful pictures that I have had to get over the past 20 years of my life to show Blackness in a completely different light than what history may teach us that it is. So Mississippi Zion, the struggle for liberation, because it's a struggle. One group gives, another group takes, give and take, give and take. So that's the struggle part of it. So
Howard, I can't wait.
Well,
I have to wait until 2022. I know, but I can't wait to read it. It sounds just wonderful.
Now of making sure that the book is right and copy edited and etc. But I'm excited, and I hope that once it comes out, that people will read it and really get a truer understanding of the Black experience and why there is a need to repair.
Howard, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for today's conversation. It's been wonderful, and I'm serious. We'll probably have to have you back. Well, thank you, Howard, very much. Thank you for watching, everybody. That's it for today's morning show. I hope you join us next Thursday at 9 for the morning show at 9 on Channel 9. If you missed any part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show at ncmhub.org. Just click on the YouTube icon and scroll down. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8, and then again the following Tuesday at 4 and Wednesday at 3, and will be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just go to ncmhub.org, click on the cloud icon, and scroll down. That's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye, Howard.
Bye. Have a great.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.